Thank you very much, Vesna Goldsworthy, for the opportunity to have this conversation. My first question is this one: which is the most autobiographical of your novels?
It is a difficult question, because the counter question would be, what do you mean by autobiographical? So Iron Curtain, Cortina de Fier, my most recent one, is most autobiographical when it comes to the portrayal of England and London in the 1980s, but least autobiographical when it comes to the personal story of my main character. So I'm most definitely not the daughter of a vice president of a communist country, and my story is not that of Medea, which is what inspired the novel. At the same time, when you look at Monsieur Karenin, the one just before, which is set in 1947 and has a French woman as the main character, and you would think, and it's narrated in this English language from the 1940s, you would think there's nothing autobiographical about that. And yet it actually has some characters that I met in real life, including a Russian prince who used to play Sergei Karenin in the film of Anna Karenina with Vivian Leigh, and the setting in West London is very autobiographical. So autobiography is a difficult question. The only properly autobiographical book that I wrote is my memoir, Chernobyl Strawberries, which is now 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Is there still an iron curtain of memory, a curtain that separates East from West?
What a fantastic question. I thought that the Iron Curtain had dropped in 1989, but then in 1990s, when my homeland, Yugoslavia as it then was, started disintegrating in bloody wars, I realized that there is a kind of Iron Curtain of the mind in the way East regards West and the West regards East, and they kind of, as Kipling would say, never the twain shall meet. They don't quite understand each other, even when they try. And I think what was going on this year, though I never wrote this novel with Ukraine and Russia in mind, actually in some ways confirms that maybe the real Iron Curtain is going up again. It's moved further east, but the Iron Curtain of the mind is really unchanged. When you look at stereotypes of East and West, they in at least in the British newspapers, a lot of things just remind me of the 60s and the 70s.
Mm-hmm. East-West, is this a major axis that runs through your novels?
It is indeed, and it wasn't meant to be like that. Each time I write a novel, I sort of say to myself, either I'm going to write a very English novel now that is set in London and that has nothing to do with Eastern Europe, because I want to prove something to myself. But what happens is that the moment I start writing, and this is what happened with Monsieur Karenin. So when I started writing Monsieur Karenin, it was a novel of adultery that was set in West London with a French character and an English character. And before you knew it, there was a second story, which was about Russian emigres. I laugh because I can't help myself. I think your past, your autobiography, influences the way you see the world. And so probably, even if I chose to write about Italy, I'll probably, before you know it, have a Romanian or a Serbian character walking onto the stage.
Mm-hmm. What kind of wealth, what kind of treasure is this, to belong to two worlds, to be in between? What kind of treasure is this condition for a writer? Sorry for my voice, I catch a cold and sorry.
It's the season of colds.
Okay.
It is a treasure and it is a curse. You never escape that double belonging, and you never quite feel at home. Sometimes I have students who come from all kinds of countries, not just in Eastern Europe, and I always tell them, if you spend longer than 5 years somewhere, you will no longer belong to either place properly. If you mean to return, don't stay more than 5 years. What I found is that I feel a little bit foreign in both places, but at the same time, the double belonging creates a sense of understanding. I wrote about this. My memoir was serialized on the BBC, and there was a little episode which was called The English Smile. And this is a good illustration, because when I first came to Britain, I realized that British people smile much more often than the Serbs. The Serbs are very serious, right? But the way the British people smile is with their lips alone and not with their eyes, right? And so I said I had to master the language of smiles, which is a kind of way of saying that although you think you know the language, you also have to learn everything afresh. The gestures, the meaning, the irony is very different. So, for example, when I first came to England and people said, oh, she's so clever, she speaks so many languages, it took me a long time to understand that she's so clever is ironical rather than a compliment, right? And that is the kind of illustration of what you're asking. It is a huge source of richness for a writer, but it is a painful learning process for a woman or a man.
Your smile is in English, but when you're crying in Serbian, maybe.
I think you're probably right. It's a kind of thing that I find now very difficult to tell apart. I did a program for Radio 4, which was finding a voice in a foreign language. And I spoke to linguists and people who actually research this topic. And they said that the last thing you keep in your mother tongue are the numbers. You know, you go to a shop and you start buying things. And if you are doing your multiplication table, the numbers still come in your mother tongue. But I then said to one of these linguists that actually the emotion is still something that remains in your mother tongue in that sort of sense. When I get really upset or when I want to argue, suddenly the Serbian starts sort of pouring out.
Are you a writer who mediates between two words? Is this your intention?
When I started my writing career, I started with an academic work. It's called Inventing Ruritania. It's somewhere on the shelves behind me. And that was a study which took me something like 10 years to research about the way in which the British have perceived the Balkans. And in some ways, although I never dreamt at that stage that I would also become a creative writer, that book had marked the beginning of that mediation, that I kept being invited to TV programs, radio programs, always asked to speak for the other. So if I go to Belgrade, I'm asked to speak about England. If I'm speaking in for British media, I'm asked about Serbia, and I'm introduced in Britain as a Serbian writer. And when I go to Serbia, I'm introduced as a British writer of Serbian origin. Right? Mm-hmm. I don't feel I'm of Serbian origin. I think I'm totally Serbian, but that's a kind of, I think it's because I write in English. So yes, it's a sort of, this role of mediation is something that was imposed on me in some ways. I don't mean forcibly, but it's a natural thing that happens.
Mm-hmm. Who are the masters of your writing? Magisters from Serbia, or better said, from the former Yugoslavia, from Great Britain, from France maybe, and from Russia, very probably.
It's a very, very good question, because I studied comparative literature, and Russian and French literature were my main fields. What I found when I came to Britain is that I couldn't read the Russians in Serbian. When I was growing up, I was reading them in Serbian translation because translation was very good. So I learned to read Russian, the languages are similar, in order to read the masters. So Chekhov, Tolstoy, definitely. And I like this thing about Chekhov that I think when you read Chekhov as a student, you don't quite understand what Chekhov is about. When you reach the middle age, it just falls on you like a ton of bricks, that whole tragedy of life, right? So Chekhov is one of those people. I like very poetic French writing. I still read that in French. So for example, Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize this year, I discovered Annie many years ago and have read everything of hers. Also Marguerite Duras. Serbian. Now, if you are a Serbian writer living in London, everyone always asks you about Miloš Crnjanski, because actually he was born in Tongrad, in what used to be the kind of borderland in the Banat, and he lived in London in emigration, and he wrote this capital work called The Novel of London, right? And The Novel of London is a key work of the Serbian imaginary. So the moment you write a novel set in London, any Serbian literary critic would say, have you been influenced by Crnjanski, right? So I got bored answering that question, and I won't even sort of start now. But I made this little intertextual joke when I wrote Marele Gorski, the great Gorski. I called him Roman, which is a Russian name, but also means a novel in my language, because that was Roman in London rather than Roman of London, as it were. And it was my little tongue-in-cheek reference to Crnjanski, because it's another heavy burden I had to carry, which was sort of always pit myself against the kind of most, one of the greatest 20th century writers in my mother tongue. It looks as though I'm trying to take his place, but I'm not.
Is exile also a very hard form of knowledge and self-knowledge? Exile is, by the way, a great topic for your prose books.
I embrace the notion of exile in this literary way, but I also always have to say that my type of emigration, there's a bit in my memoir where I say, what am I? I'm not quite an exile when you compare myself to people who had to escape their countries for political reasons. I'm not quite an emigre. I'm not quite a migrant. There is no right name for someone who chooses to leave her country. But because the country disintegrated behind me, I left Yugoslavia in the mid-80s, I found myself feeling more like an exile than I did at the beginning. And I certainly find myself attracted to the literature of exile. So although Iron Curtain has a subtitle, Love Story, that is really just for the publishers because they thought that Iron Curtain was a hard title, but it is in fact a story of exile and a political novel, if you want. It's kind of furtively political. Its big political themes are hidden behind these two people that fall in love, boy meet girl story. And I think one characteristic of a writer in exile is this preoccupation with politics. I think I'm more political. Had I stayed in Belgrade, had I written in Serbian, I'd probably have been a completely different writer, certainly less political, probably more intimate in my preoccupations. It's difficult to guess.
Mm-hmm. You write in English a lot, but do you dream in Serbian?
I dream in both. Witnesses have testified that when I speak in my sleep, it's, you know what in English they say rhubarb, it's nonsense, right? It's because obviously the languages create a muddle in my head. God only knows what I dream in. I have a friend here, Elena Lapin, who speaks 6 or 7 languages, and she says that she dreams in Czech, although she's Russian by origins. I no longer know what language I dream in. It's probably Serbian, but I don't know.
What language do you write the poems in?
That's a fabulous question, because I wrote a collection of poetry called The Angel of Salonika. It's a very slim book, and it was the Times best poetry book of 2011. But secretly, the book was written in 2 languages, in Serbian and in English, because I say secretly, because when the poems first come to me, the images normally come in Serbian, and then I develop them in one or the other. And the secret bit refers to the not so secret fact that I convinced the editors to pressurize the British Library, but also the Serbian National Library in Belgrade, to allow me ISBNs, you know, those international numbers, so that both books are original. That is very, very rare. Librarians don't like that kind of thing, because I could no longer tell which was the original language of that collection. But behind your question is a very hard question, and that is that when I was writing exclusively in Serbian, I wrote an awful lot of poetry. When I surrounded myself by English and started thinking in English, poetry dwindled to almost nothing. Now, I maybe write 3, 4, 5 poems a year at most, which is why it took me forever to write a very slim collection. It is as though poetry likes the surrounding of a mother tongue.
Mm-hmm. Of all the literary species, for you, is poetry the most intimate?
Yeah. It's I think we are different in that sense. I know you are a writer, and I don't know in terms of your process how you would answer this question, but for me, poetry is the genre, you know, the primordial genre. So that is what when I was 4, I wrote my first poem. It was no good, but it was a poem. And so it was the language of poetry was the language of my original literary expression. I think what happens is that you, in some ways, you give a task to yourself to write a novel. I now teach novel writing, and it is interesting. Serbian poet said that a novel is the baccalaureate of literature. you feel you haven't really made it until you write a novel. And so I don't know why, but that was what, being ambitious as I am, I wrote poetry, and I wrote this critical work, but I felt, I got to try myself in a novel. So that was really what pushed poetry aside rather than supplanted.
Mm-hmm. My questions are not directly perpendicular, are like in Odyssey, like a navigation in circle. Actually, I want to ask you like this: where are your at home? What is at home for you? It is a specifically physical place, or it is something that goes beyond physical coordinates? It is something like a state.
A library is at home for me. I had this display of my books behind me because I was giving a lot of interviews in the last 2 or 3 days, but behind the display is a mass of books, and I'm sitting in a room which has probably several hundred Serbian books and several hundred English books. When you go through my house, I'm like, I mean, there are rooms where you have to kind of walk around books because I can't get rid of them. towers and towers of books. And I need that. I have more books than I can read. Even if I read a book a day, I possess more books than I can read in a lifetime, because that is what makes me feel at home. And I find when I travel, if I'm touring, I will very often go to a university library, whatever place. I remember I was at a book fair in Yash, and I said, "Where is your university library?" Because there I feel rooted. You know, I recognize a title. It may be Ulysses, you mentioned. It may be something I read, and I'm instantly at home. It's absolutely, and it's the only place I've ever felt it fully at home in that sense.
What is Ruritania, and actually is Ruritania the spirit of Ruritania presents in your work of fiction, in your novels?
It in this particular book, Iron Curtain, I said at a particular point that I wanted my main character, Milena, to be from Eastern Europe, but not from a specific place. And the reason for that was that I could combine elements of different histories of different East European countries, so that there are pieces of Romania, there are pieces of Bulgaria. There's a particular character which is directly based on Bulgarian history. There are pieces of Romania. This is what I researched when I was writing Inventing Ruritania, and it became a kind of food for this novel. So in some ways, you know that film, The Empire Writes Back? This is Ruritania Writes Back, that I used my academic research to create this imaginary place, because I wanted to be about Iron Curtain and not about a particular country. It's actually interesting. The novel won a big literary prize in Serbia earlier this year. And the journalist kept saying, "Is this Serbia?" And I said, "No, it isn't. Is there on first page, I say that it isn't." So I kind of distanced it, but like a magpie, took a feather from each place. So that's Ruritania. It's combined, it's a set of elements of, in Ruritanian case, of the Balkans, here probably more broadly Eastern Europe. Though, I need to say, this is now a professor speaking. When Anthony Hope wrote Ruritania originally, he gave it this name, like rural. So it's a kind of peasant, backward country. Yes. But he said, you get to Ruritania by traveling by train to Dresden. And then from Dresden, you ride a horse 2 hours south. And I calculated that therefore the original Ruritania was probably somewhere around Prague. But what happened with the film industry is that they moved Ruritania to the Balkans, because Prague was too, quote unquote, civilized for them. So all the films Ruritania became a Balkan country through the power of film industry, because they needed a real peasant society with folk costumes, not, kind of like children, not fully European. And so this was my revenge, Iron Curtain, for that.
What does London represent for your novels? All three have something to do with London. What is the London in your novels really like?
I have now lived in London longer than anywhere else, so almost 40 years. And London is an enormous city. I think that at the moment there are probably around 200,000 Romanians living in London. So it's a big Romanian city, it's a big Serbian city, it's a big French city. When the French elections take place, there's a long queue, not very far from where I live, because there are literally thousands of French people coming to vote. And this is London, this kind of Babylon. And because it's enormous, it's 70 plus kilometers from one end or another. It is actually almost impossible to leave London. We all live like in some kind of city state, yeah? And London is surrounded by England, but London is not England. And it actually, many of us who live in London really forget what England is like. You know, now sometimes when I take a train to go to the seaside, you sort of suddenly go out of this city and you are in England. There is that moment in this novel, which I say, l'Angleterre profonde, the deepest, darkest England, because in London you forget that this country is still there, and that this country could vote differently and has different political agendas. So London, for me, yeah, it's a city-state. It's a universe. It's really is this enormous thing. When I first came to London, I absolutely adored the fact that I think I said that somewhere. If the world perished, you could reconstruct it from one underground train, because there are representatives of each nation on it, and you know, like Noah's Ark. And I loved that when I was in my 20s. But now I hate it, because I'm getting old and there are too many people and I just want parks and greenery. And so I sit on the train and I think, who are all these people? Where are they coming from? You know, I could have said that about myself in the 80s. And it is because it's like a human hive. Yeah, we're like these sort of insects milling everywhere, and it is now too big, too crowded, too noisy, too everything.
You, on the other hand, you work a lot with myths about East and about West. Which of these great myths are more helpful for us? Which are more harmful for us?
So the myths, they're differently helpful and differently harmful. The myths of the East, particularly perceptions of the Balkans, were very, I thought that they were very innocent until I realized how they influence politics. So, for example, the speed with which particular countries are admitted to the EU, the speed at which countries you feel are your allies and friends and which feel distant, etc. I felt in particular, you see, Serbia is now described as Western Balkans. When I came to England, Western Balkans didn't exist, because if Serbia is Western Balkans, where's Central Balkans? Where's the East, right? The whole thing is moving, and it's influenced, this imaginary geography is influenced by our stereotypes, yeah? And that is a kind of danger. The myth of the West is probably less politically dangerous, simply because countries of the East don't have the same power. But where it is dangerous, at least I found that probably in the part of the world I come from, is that we have this kind of myth of migration, which means that we're driven not just by economic necessity, but also by a kind of a version of, you know, what Arthur Miller calls the American dream. We think we need to succeed in the West, and that somehow that drives a lot of people to emigrate, which I think is not necessarily for the good. It means there is a kind of brain drain, but only some of those people who emigrate will be happy and successful. An awful lot of people are pulled by the dream to end in a kind of cul-de-sac, in a sort of existence that, you know, that a kind of, on the whole, they would have been happier in their towns in, I don't know, Maramuresh or you know, it's a kind of, so this myth of the West is not always helpful.
Could we say that your great characters live under a kind of terror of history? I mean, all three novels published by you.
Yes. This is one of the things that I examined in Iron Curtain, and I set out to examine because I found that the difference between me and probably my English friends of long time, is this perception of destiny. that somehow I believe in things being fated, being destined, whereas I'm simplifying now, whereas my English friends believe in kind of free will, agency, that you do something and you have the power to be whatever you want to be. And both of those things are to an extent true and to an extent false. But my particular take has been conditioned by the fact that in the world I come from, which was, if you want, under Ottoman rule for many centuries and was then socialist, etc., individual will is stymied. There was a kind of, for long centuries, you couldn't do what you wanted to do. You know, that kind of, you couldn't follow your dream. Following your dream is a luxury, right? So this is a kind of, this is the way in which we are shaped by the burdens of history, even without realizing. In Chernobyl Strawberries, I have this episode. So this is autobiographical as opposed to my novels. And it is about my father-in-law, where he says he was an army officer. He's now dead, where I tell him about my uncle. So my uncle, my maternal uncle, was an army officer before the Second World War and was then in an officers' camp in Germany. And when he came back from Germany after the Second World War, he became involved in sport, and eventually he became a sports minister, right? And I told this story to my father-in-law, and because I thought, okay, this is a fellow Royal Army officer, and my father-in-law's reaction was, what do you mean? He gave his oath of allegiance to the king, and then he was serving the communists? And you know what my reaction to that was? This is the luxury of being English. That it's just, they didn't have those earthquakes in their history, right? That you could pledge an oath of allegiance to the king and kind of keep going. Where I come from, that was impossible. So it's the way of thinking is shaped by that. That's a kind of answer. It's an example, but it's an answer to your question as well. And in my novels, I do examine that, how we are shaped by history, even in these ordinary, human, intimate stories.
Do these characters still have illusions? And the second one question linked by this, they are, on the other hand, the great characters, mostly very lucid. Is lucidity a burden, like a big stone?
It is a burden, and they are self-reflective in that sort of sense. But I choose my narrators because I know I'm driven that way. I think if I tried to choose a narrator, Beckettian narrator, I don't know that I could write that very well, like Beckett, in those sort of very small sentences, not really observing human condition in this kind of long, reflective way that I do. I actually choose my characters so that in some ways I could speak through them. Just as I choose foreigners. All my novels are narrated by people whose English is not their mother tongue. Because it's like an opera singer, I know what my vocal range is, and I've sort of got to learn that. But so similarly, I choose people who are going to be lucid, because that increases my pleasure of writing. Who was it? Was it Dr. Johnson who said, "Only a fool ever wrote but for the money." You just write for money. I'm the opposite. I really don't. I write for myself. So it has to be, in that sort of sense, maybe I'm a fool, but it has to be pleasurable.
Two more questions. First, what saves these characters in the worlds they come from or inhabit? Love, lucidity, memory?
What saves them?
Yes.
That's a difficult one. Probably a bit of each one of those. I'm romantic enough to want to write about love, but not in that kind of romantic novel way. I'm more lucid, and some journalists, British journalists here, asked me if I thought that Milena was very cold. And I said, no, it's just that she's lucid, precisely in the way you describe. Memory too. But I wrote somewhere that love, we talk about Western dreams. Love is a Western dream in the way we perceive it now, because it's like an opium of the masses. What happens is that in the West, people tell you, romantic movies, etc., that all you need is to find someone to fall in love, and then you'll be happy forever. And it is the opium of the masses because it diverts you from the realities of your condition, which may be to do with class or limitations, which are actually not salvageable by love, right? There are things that love can do, but there are lots of things that love can't do.
Mm-hmm. And the last one, what is your big dream about literature? What do you dream literature can do? What do you dream you can do with literature?
It's actually something that I think about almost every day, because I teach creative writing. I never dreamed that I would talk about dreams, that I would teach creative writing. I started teaching English literature, my academic career, 19th century English literature. They moved me to creative writing when I started writing novels, because it's an expanding discipline and they need teachers in that discipline. And you think this is a digression. It isn't. It's that when you teach creative writing, you're supposed to believe in literature, right? In the power of literature, because your students pay a lot of money to come to you to learn how to write. So your livelihood depends on what you're doing being worthwhile. Yet as an artist and as a novelist yourself, you have those dark nights of the soul when actually you think, what good is literature? Could it really do anything? It's really, so it's a kind of, I have like Jekyll and Hyde. I have two sides of me answering those questions differently. My dream is that literature could matter, would make us better people. My experience is that it probably becomes less and less important, and it doesn't change people as much as you think. Literary fiction in particular is an endangered genre. More and more people write fantasy, more and more people write fictional versions of computer games. I don't know. So yeah, if you ask me that question, within minutes I become really depressed. You should come to my class, and then you could hear the positive sides.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was a great conversation.
Not at all. Thank you for the lovely questions.
I am a big fan of your novel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.